Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I've been making some good progress on the film recently with a few new shots, this one being one of them. I've really been enjoying some painting time where I can just focus on painting backgrounds. I have a ton of nature paintings that needs to be done for this project, as this is set in like an outdoor alpine environment. Sometimes it's nice to just completely lose yourself in the painting process. But since there are so many shots that are sort of similar, covering different angles of the same scenes, I don't want it to get to a point where I find it's boring to paint them, so I try to vary it up with a bit of character animation in between. I did not record the full process of this painting, sadly. Sometimes you just, want to get to work and not have the pressure of the recording on. I had already established the base colors and gotten to a point where the lighting was working. Now it's just a lot of time that needs to be spent on polishing and carving out shapes and defining textures for all the elements within the scene. This is for me almost an automated process, meaning it doesn't require my full focus. I can listen to some podcasts or even chat to a friend over Hangouts or something. Of course, I'm still taking the decisions, but I think it's a different part of the brain that is working then, so it allows me to multitask. What you see here is from that process. The overall image is there, it's just missing details really. It's a very relaxing process where I can just spend a few hours touching up the details and cleaning up the rough underpainting that I did previously. Sometimes I just do the very rough establishing painting and then move on to another scene, as I can already tell that this will be what I'm after. I can then at a later stage return and clean it up. Some days I feel more like in the mood of constructing the shot from scratch, which takes a lot more focus and decision making, so then I use that energy on more than one shot. Then on a day that I'm not so on it, I can just come back and polish things. For this polishing phase, you could go on forever, of course, but I think I'm aiming for a result where it looks rendered in most places, but I don't want to overpaint it, meaning adding too much specific details and just making it busy. It's a tricky balancing act, and it's easy to get caught up too much in the details. A good trick for me is to leave the painting for a bit, and if I feel like it looks unfinished when I return, then it normally needs more work. If you have spent a bunch of hours looking at it, you will know all the small parts that are not fully attended to, but maybe as a first-time viewer, you won't see any of that. I think having a bit of brush strokes come through looks quite nice too, so I try not to go mad about the details. The overall time I spend on just the painting is probably between 8 or 12 hours, but yeah, it really varies. If it's a close-up, it often takes a bit longer. I don't think I'm the fastest of painters, so I let things take its time. I sort of have to play around with each area until it starts to look like something. So here we have the background somewhat done. I then moved over to the characters. I first did a very quick and rough sketch of them both, making sure that they are placed in the scene where I want them. I then start animating with super loose lines what I want to happen. The idea here is that these two guys have just arrived at this big boulder and are looking up at it. In some scenes before this, they have been hiking up the mountain, and in this shot, the guy on the right will push his crash pad over. This sort of helps to indicate that they've gotten to their end goal. Basically, no more walking is to be done. For this crash pad, I actually lined my scene up in Cinema 4D quickly and just modeled a very simple geometry of the pad that I then animated there. I could then render that out and bring it into Photoshop, where I could then draw my lines on top of it, basically using a 3D as a reference. I think this is a very valuable method in many cases. I often mock things up in 3D just to get the perspective right, and then I might just use it for reference when painting or animating. This way I can test out how the motion of the pad should look and within minutes I have something I know will work. When animating the characters, I go through a few passes. I first make a very rough representation of the motion I want. I don't really focus too much on making pretty drawings at this stage. This pass is only to sell the motion, really. I think a bit about anatomy, of course, and how his arm will bend and swing, but I don't need to draw the full hand or anything yet. It can be a blob at this time, just to know where things will go. I then keep layering, adding new layers on top, lowering the opacity of what I've already done, and start over, drawing somewhat cleaner versions of the character. I might redraw the same frame a few times here to get it to the standard that I'm happy with. I can then start to focus on the upcoming frames, as I've gotten the first frame to a good place, and I can use that as my reference for how I want the rest to look. If there's a lot of change in the pose of the character, you might want to do this for a few frames throughout, so you have some solid keyframes established. These line drawings will actually not be seen in the end, as I will go over it with blocks of colors, but I think it really helps me to define the motion this way. With lines I can be a bit more experimental, as they can overlap each other without looking too strange, and once they're defined relatively well, I can then start focusing on colors. When it comes to color, I prefer to first get one frame fully drawn out. That way I can see how he will look finished. But then I target specific areas one at a time. Here I started with getting the head colored before moving on to the blue part of his jacket, for example. This speeds things up, as I don't have to swap colors around, and I can solely concentrate on one part at a time and not forgetting how things looked in the previous frame. For the second character, I decided to just go for a static frame for this shot, so all I needed to do for him was just to do a clean drawing. For shading, I dropped a video layer on top of my animation and filled each frame with black. I set it to be a clipping mask of the animation layers, so that it only affects those layers and not the background. I lowered the opacity of the whole layer and then erased out the parts I wanted to be hit by the sun. They are mostly shaded by the boulder here, so I just gave their upper bodies a slight hint of the light. I wanted the camera to slowly come down like a crane shot, so I did some simple projection setup in Cinema 4D to get a little bit of parallax on the foreground and the boulder. I didn't need to map out all the elements, but just get a general smooth geometry that could help to give the scene some depth. I cut out the far background and added that on a separate layer further back in the scene as well. For small subtle movements like this, I think this works alright. Something that helps to sell the parallax is to separate some foreground elements, like the plants in the bottom right corner here. You would quickly see if this was a projected image if they were like laying flat onto the geometry. So I just imported those as separate cards. If you want to see additional videos about my process of the film, then check out my Patreon. I frequently add videos there where I go into more depth about my methods. Recently I did a video about my painting process for this shot, for example. Massive thanks to you guys who already support me there. Here's the final shot for this animation. Hit subscribe to follow along as I work on my film here on YouTube. I got a lot of shots I want to make videos about, so stay tuned for that. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.